So, short introduction on my behalf. My name is Egbert Schram, Group CEO at The Culture Factor, and for roughly 2 decades now, been engaged with the topic of culture from one perspective, which is culture is an emotional topic, and emotions tend to have a habit of going in all kinds of directions, typically in opposite directions. So my motivation as a group CEO for the Culture Factor is to help people have a rational discussion about emotions. And that is what we do within the Culture Factor. We make an emotional topic such as culture rationally quantifiable so that you can have better discussions. If you want to know more about what this means for you as an individual, I recommend reading my book published in December last year, Navigating Foreigners, Stories of Cultural Adaptations and Belonging. But that's not going to be the focus for today. Today's focus is about lessons from companies you see on the screen in front of you in terms of what is culture, in specific organizational culture, and how does it help you with strategic challenges. In our panel discussion, we will then dive deeper with personal examples from both Miriam and Sophie. This is the structure as mentioned, short introduction, then we'll get started on defining culture. We go into the panel, and then it's time for Q&A. So, what is organizational culture, and why is it important to lead it, to shape it, to actively, proactively use it in your day-to-day work environment? Because culture will happen whether you like it or not. So it's a question of being on top of it. Organizational culture is basically telling you how do people engage with each other at work. And importantly, whether that is going to help you with your strategy execution or is going to hinder you. That being said, culture is not everything. So despite the fact that today we talk about culture, keep in mind it's one element of a successful strategy. You do need a good strategy and you do need a proper set of products or services, obviously. But your organizational culture is going to inform you. Will you be effective and efficient and, importantly, sustainable in doing what you do in the best way possible? If you think about culture from a layer perspective, there are the things that we can see that happen inside an organization, the behaviors that we observe or not observe, the logos that teams might or might not have, the behaviors that people display in order to get promoted or to find their way out of a company or a team. There are rituals that companies have or often case don't have. An example is, do you in your organization celebrate or learn from mistakes? You might think, why would we want to do that? Well, my answer would be, why not? Because otherwise you're not going to learn. The point is, out of these layers, we talk about organizational culture. It's practices, it's decisions on how you go about doing things, and also not making a decision is a decision. The second component that is very important for us in our work, especially when we talk about emotional sustainability, is the core of culture. In other words, value differences or emotional preference over one way opposed to another way. That is something that we capture when we talk about national culture. Now, in today's discussions, we might jump between these topics, but to keep it simple, there are the things we do, organizational culture, and there's how we feel about it, typically national culture. That's the summary of both approaches. If we think about the definition of culture, you might remember Hofstede's definition of culture is the collective programming of the human mind, with which one group differs from another. Already quite a good definition, but an organization is slightly different than a country. So when we define organizational culture, the way we talk about it, and you will hear examples today, it's about the way in which members of an organization connect to each other, meaning their bosses, their colleagues, their subordinates, connect to their work. What is more important, the process or the outcome? And of crucial importance, the outside world. If people work for an employer that has a negative public image, they will bring that negativity, that defensiveness back into the company, and it will increase the chance, for example, of silo formation. Because when people are under a lot of pressure, they bond in smaller circles. Potentially useful, but potentially harmful, depending on what your strategy is. So that outside component is very important. And as always with culture, when we talk about culture, it's about the relative differences between one group to the other. If you say your company has an open culture, the reflective question is compared to whom? And the more important question is, isn't having an open culture nice? Slash, more importantly, is it functional for the type of work you do? So in our approach to organizational culture, it's always about relative differences and the benchmark to your strategy. That is what counts. Now, as mentioned before, there are things that you can see simply by walking around inside an organization. Sometimes we have customers that talk about the value of people, but then you walk around their office and you don't see any picture of people. Sometimes people talk about respect for, let's say, experience, but when you walk around, you talk around, it's not about the experience, it's about loyalty to a particular individual over another, irrespective of experience. So culture has visible components, artifacts, as you might call them, and then there are the things that come behind it, the underlying values. And when you want to assess if a corporate culture is sustainable in terms of its effectiveness, the ability to execute a strategy, it's the undercurrents that you want to pay attention to. Why does it matter? Well, obviously, for you, it matters, otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But if you need to convince stakeholders, obviously, financials is one reason why organizational culture matters. There's enough scientific background literature available that indicates that paying attention to your corporate culture can raise your EBIT level, so your actual profit, with up to 34%. That's not little, that's a lot. On the emotional end, why do you want to care? I think it's safe to say that most organizations nowadays suffer in terms of their ability to attract and retain talent. And often case, this comes because of a culture clash between what gets done, how it gets done, and how it makes people feel. So if you look inside your organization and you see that people tend to move in and out every 2 years, 3 years, the likelihood is quite big that you have a culture clash between the rational way of working and the emotional preference of people, because 2 to 3 years is kind of like the breakdown point for people to no longer want to work against what they emotionally prefer. So you can follow HR data, HR metrics to get a feel for, hey, do we have a cultural issue inside our organization? And again, remember, everything is impacted by culture, but not everything is culture. So some other examples of where organizational culture matters before we dive into our panel shortly. Do you work in a way that supports your strategy goals? Meaning, do you execute your work in the most efficient and effective way possible? Therefore, financial performance. Are you more competitive or less competitive in terms of turnover per head compared to your competitors? Often case, this is not an issue of business modeling or product quality, because we all need to have a good business model. We all need to have excellent product quality or service quality. What makes the difference is culture. Decision-making styles, innovation. A lot of companies talk about innovation, but is your culture ready for innovation? Let alone, is your organization clear on the type of innovation that you need? Is that the disruptive type of innovation, or is that process innovation, which requires a very different mentality? This is often a challenge, for example, for startup to scale up companies. They go from a very easygoing way of work, breakthrough innovation, and then they grow, they need to develop structures, and things need to become processed. That's not just a systemic switch, that's a mental switch. Customer satisfaction, reputation, brand image, culture impacts all of these topics and many, many, many more. So is there one best culture to aim for? There, the answer is actually no. There is no such thing as having one organizational culture because units, business departments, typically strive for slightly different angles to the same strategy. And that means that their culture ideally is somewhat fine-tuned to the nature of their respective tasks. We call that functional diversity. Sales and marketing, sales and production, they need to work together, so they need to have enough in common. Yet their jobs are so different that they need to be able to work in slightly different ways. And part of being a cultural practitioner is knowing where to build similarities and where to enable people to deviate. Now, what does this mean in practice? It means in practice, you need to be quite smart when you talk about looking into the different parts of your organization. Sometimes it could be an hierarchical difference regarding their ways of working. Sometimes it's a functional difference. Sometimes it's an age cohort. Millennials, Gen Z might want to have a different way of working than the managers, typically X generation. Yet then how do you go about aligning that? That's where data will help you to find the answer that fits to your context. Now, if you think about culture from multiple layers, we talk about culture from 4 perspectives. There is how you would like your culture to be. There is how you think your culture is, perception. There is what your culture actually is. That's what we measure. And then there is what your culture needs to be. Needs to be. That's a choice, and that choice has to be realistic. So to summarize our approach, which we call the multi-focus model to organizational culture, what it does is it tells you what's the culture your organization currently has, whether that culture supports or hinders your strategic goals in terms of speed, quality, etc. It is benchmarked with what your organization needs. That's the only relevant benchmark. Don't care about your competitors. As a Finnish rally racer said, if you look at your competition, you don't know where you're going. So your culture needs to support your strategy, not your competitors. Importantly, from leadership perspective, do leaders walk the talk? Do they behave in a way that carries forward that optimal way of working? Where might you need to change, if you need to change? And how do you build on the emotional preferences that employees have to push that change into the emotionally sustainable direction? That's in a nutshell what our approach promises. But that's just me talking. More important is 2 practitioners. We have prepared them with 3 questions to generate a discussion, but we do kindly ask all of you in the audience to put questions that you had or have or get during this discussion, put those questions in the chat so that we can ideally spend some time at the end of today's session to reflect on your specific questions. Before we get to those questions, let's do a short introduction, and I'll start with Sophie. Sophie, could you shortly introduce yourself, and after you, we'll jump to Miriam.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Egbert, and good day, everyone. And yes, my name is Sophie Lafleur. I am from Belgium. I have an academic background in geology, and after obtaining that degree, I moved to Africa, where I lived and worked for about 12 years in great countries like Kenya, Burundi, Namibia, and South Africa. I have worked for the United Nations, various NGOs, and the Belgian and Luxembourg bilateral cooperation. I have managed projects in diverse sectors such as water and sanitation, health, education, construction, and child welfare. In this capacity, I have collaborated with numerous companies, both small and large, local and international. I interacted with many different people and cultures, and I realized the importance of organizational culture. In 2012, I founded my own company in Luxembourg called Mandeleo, which means development in Swahili. I trained in neurocognitive and behavioral approaches, in systemic approach to business, in several personnel assessment tools, and in change management. 3 years ago, I joined Planze, or Ceratizid for some. It's an international industrial group. I joined them on a part-time basis as a culture development manager. And in this role, I trained in organizational culture with the culture factor to have a measurement tool. And today, my work with Mendeleo and Plan Z is based on this approach.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Let's jump to Miriam. Miriam, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Hello. Oh, I hope. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Miriam Grobman. I'm originally from Russia, grew up in Israel. I moved to the US when I was around 16. And I had my formal education or my undergraduate and graduate education in the United States. Degrees in computer science, economics. I have an MBA and a Master's of Arts. And I worked when I was in the US, I had exposure to the oil and gas and banking industry and also cosmetics industry in kind of strategy finance roles. And for a job opportunity, I ended up in Brazil working for a very large industrial Brazilian company. And that's when I got exposed. This was back in 2013 or so. I got exposed to the Culture Factor Group tools because we're doing a very, very large culture change project, and the company was immense. So this tool really helped us narrow down the conversation and move towards certain areas where we wanted to focus. Since then, I haven't worked in large culture projects, and in 2014, I founded my management consulting company, and I worked with small and large companies on leadership development and management strategy and business processes. But in the last year or so, I went back to working with organizational culture with a few companies that want to either scale up their culture or build a new and different culture that kind of breaks down a lot of paradigms of large industrial companies. So I'm kind of rethinking organization culture in some different ways, but still using some of these principles as the foundation of the discussions that we are having. So I'm very excited to have this discussion with other people from different perspectives, and I hope to share some interesting insights with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Sophie, for the introduction. Now, in order to prepare Sophie and Miriam for our discussion today, we did share questions with them up front in terms of the questions that I had in mind. That's not to say that there can't be questions from the audience that they might not have prepared for, but the questions they have prepared for were the following questions. And this will be the basis of our initial panel discussion before we open up for public Q&A. So let's start with that first question. How to bring culture into strategic questions or discussions and convince stakeholders to make the necessary, let's say, resources, budget, time, money, people available. It's a question that people often struggle with. Now, you both mentioned in your introduction your varied experience between large multinationals versus governmental, non-governmental scale-ups. Sophie, let's start with you. In your experience, how have you seen culture being brought into that executive level discussion cycle?
Okay, maybe I can take the example of Plan Z, where it was at the instigation of one of its board members that the culture department was created. And the initial challenge was definitely to convince the leadership team and the rest of the board members to embrace this concept of organizational culture. It took some time, but eventually we succeeded in getting them on board and adopting the cultural factor model. So it was also there, which tool are we going to use? Culture factor is not the only one, but it was finally the more convincing for the Plan Z group. And now we have the advantage of top management strong support. They actively encourage all sides to work on measuring and developing their culture from Asia to the US. And once the work begins, then people become enthusiastic and quickly recognize both immediate benefits and midterm strategic directions. So that was how it was for the Planze Group. In other organizations, although I would say it becomes a more popular topic today than it was a decade ago, for example, it remains somewhat intangible and challenging to discuss. The culture journey, as we can call it, is a long-term process that requires significant commitment from top management in terms of time, reflection, and emotion, as you mentioned earlier, investment. The new generation are also pushing companies to engage in this reflection. So I see more and more companies interested by the topic, but still it takes time internally to go on to the process.
Yeah. Thanks, Sophie. Miriam, in your experience, both relating back to the original very large project to now the scale-up discussions, how do you see this question in terms of when does culture kind of come on people's radar, and then what happens then?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question because it really depends on the company context and situation and type of leadership, etc. In the large industrial company, they had a lot of issues and conflict because the company was only Brazilian, and then it grew a lot and acquired other companies in other parts of the world. So they had a lot of issues in integrating these subsidiaries, a lot of issues in making their operations in Brazil more effective, reacting to market conditions. And there was some understanding that some cultural aspects maybe didn't help some of the results they wanted to have. But one of the challenges, and I think both of you touched upon that, is for you to have a productive discussion on these topics, you need to make some of these intangible aspects more tangible. And at the time, I was working in this organizational strategy department. So we had an array of different kind of big intangible topics like innovation, like transformation, culture, sustainability, that we had to figure out how to make them more practical so that the executive committee could make some decisions, or we could implement some initiatives in a scaled level. And when I came in, I always say I had the virtual drawers of different consulting companies that came and prepared the report on what needs to change or what should be the other strategy, the culture, etc. And some of the challenges we had was some of these recommendation or frameworks were too abstract. So I still very intangible. We want the culture that combines with our values of innovation and accountability. And there are a lot of keywords, but it was very unclear what would be the next steps to get there. Alternatively, some of the consulting firms, they're very thorough. They did a very complex diagnostic. They brought like 150 slides of all the issues and a new cultural strategy that had 27 different dimensions and subdimension. It was extremely comprehensive, but it was very difficult to apply because there are too many things and it was unclear where to start. So at the time, one of the directors knew about Hofstede work and introduced that to me. And then I ended up going to the Netherlands to do a course and learning about this 6-dimension model. And I really liked that model because it was not too simple or abstract, but it was also not too complex. There are 6 dimensions, they're tied to business results. Maybe these are not the best, the top dimension, the perfect dimensions, but they really help structure a conversation. So this was really great because we could come in, do a quick diagnostic, see where we are in the 6 dimension, discuss with the management team, and choose where to focus. So it really helped move the conversation along and come
Yeah.
up with some actionable items. Contrasting it to where I am right now with a couple of my clients, it's a very different, both of the organization I'm thinking about, they're quite different. One is as actually a law firm that grew from 5 partners that got together and really loved working with each other and grew to a bigger size organization. So they're at the point where we really like to work together, but we can't just base it on our 5 people's energy, preferences, values. We want to kind of scale up this culture, and maybe codify what is nice and great, and maybe figure out other stuff that we need to build. So there, maybe that kind of tool is a bit more useful for discussion, but you don't need to map it because the company is small enough that you can just talk to people and figure out some stuff. But still making the intangible tangible is very useful. Let's put in words what it is that we really like, and scale that up as
Yeah.
more people join. My other client is also an industrial but R&D type of company, where they were focused on R&D and now they're going to scale up and build a business out of the insights they have and work with clients. So they need to change their way of working a little bit to change their focus. So we are again discussing culture. We're trying to make it tangible, write it down, but we're trying to think of a completely different culture that will go from a local R&D organization to a global product organization. So there again, we're trying to articulate it, and we also are trying to co-create it with all the members of the company, because they have all the knowledge and expertise, but
Thanks.
maybe so
Thanks,
so
Miriam, because it's a nice example of how like the scale of a company and maybe the state of a company is an important factor in how you go about approaching this topic of culture. Now, there's a couple of questions that came in in the chat, and I'll drag another screen in front of everybody's eyes to show people a little bit about those dimensions that we spoke about and how do we use this. So to give a practical example, let's say that you work in a startup and that tries to scale up. And we can see that most startups initially tend to be a little bit on this left-hand side. So they're quite informal. They don't necessarily know what to expect. And then at some point, maybe when they grow, they need to become a bit more serious and punctual, etc. Now, Sophie, if I'm going to ask you, you've run workshops in SitePlan, say, across the globe. Have you seen differences in terms of how the different locations slash functions relate to this, for example, this particular dimension? If there's an R&D team that wants to be kind of like in this area of flexibility, yet they need to work with compliance or product control where there is a lot more need for predictability and precision.
Yeah.
How has this helped, if it has helped?
No, it does. And especially we work in an industrial environment, so we do have production sites and we're working in shifts. So in this type of environment, you need a very strict work discipline, because obviously if you have someone that arrives and half an hour later than is expected, it's not going to work. But also people need to be very cost conscious. If they break something, what are the implications? They need to have a strict planification of the process and the work done. And sometimes it's interesting to realize that even in those environments, people would like to see more strict discipline, and it's actually the case. They really want to feel that everything is predictable and organized, and they feel more comfortable in this working way. In other departments, obviously in this company, we have marketing department, for example. We have the culture department, we have HR department. These are environments where you can look for a more easygoing type of atmosphere, where flexible work is possible in terms of time, where there's also more flexibility in the type of desk you choose in the morning eventually, but also you're a bit less constrained by some rules and regulation, because you need to be more creative, have more ideas in your today activity. So we see the need for both. And we also see that sometimes we expect people that they would like to be more easygoing, and it's the contrary. They want to see an environment that's more strict discipline, where we also make good use of resources, and we're not spoiling, especially in times of today's, where in some environment it's a little bit more difficult. So people want to see that we're making good use of all the resources.
Yeah. Miriam, this particular example of this dimension, do you recognize this in, for example, the discussions that you're having with startups, especially maybe not even startups, but let's say scale-ups, where you have people that were part of the original innovative, engaged, work-oriented entrepreneurial types, and then they grow, and then they need to hire people that, just by the virtue of starting later, have a different subculture?
That's a very complex question. So I just wanted to make a little bit connection to what Sophie said.
Yep.
It's funny because in the big industrial company, I remember that we measured this dimension for different areas. And when we saw it was dysfunctional was because on the dimensions, for example, R&D needs to be more easygoing. It was more strict. Like the departments where we needed more open system, they were more full of control and procedures. And the other way around, the departments like operations and stuff that needed more control, they were more loose or easygoing, let's say, about some of the procedures. So this was very interesting. So now when I'm working with some of these companies, I'm always thinking about these. You have to kind of balance things out and not be too loose or too rigid, but also you need to introduce some rigidness in some areas. So one of the reasons also in startups is that because everything is kind of unknown, you start kind of trying a lot of different things and restarting and doing new initiatives. So you end up using a lot of resources or repeating stuff or doing stuff manually that could be automated and organized better. So there's a question of kind of how to manage your resources better as you scale up. There's also sometimes in one of the companies I'm working with, there's the R&D and there's the operations, and both are a bit of a scale up. And one of the challenges that on one hand, the company wants to encourage a lot of innovation, and the R&D team is very creative and they change a lot of things. But what the operation guys are saying, we're willing to do that, but we need some time to structure some stuff, because this kind of very dynamic easygoing thing, for us, it's like a big problem, because we ended up working like crazy to try to meet the R&D requirements. We end up paying more for some stuff that if we knew in advance, we could buy it in advance or do that. And also there's a risk element, because you're, again, working there's a technical plant. So if you change things all the time, you're starting to risk accidents or accidents with people and accidents in materials. And for environments where that are industrial, the question of safety is extremely important. So you kind of have to bring it in. For other environments, sometimes people come from other companies that have very rigid and bureaucratic procedures, and they start trying to implement that in an innovative startup rapid environment, and they're not that helpful. Like they just create more bureaucracy, really, process that you don't need. On the other hand, some things do need process. So bringing people from the outside helps building up that process that makes things sustainable in the long term.
In both of your experiences, so you're both describing this ability to make things tangible, the fact that different units, teams work in different ways. To which extent does, in your experience, the multi-focus model that we use to map out organizational culture has it helped you to build a common language so that different teams also understand the fact that, hey, by the virtue of having to do something different, you might work in a different way? Was that one of the arguments that helped convince stakeholders that this is not yet another fluffy approach to an emotional topic?
Well, if I can answer this, I think the quality of the tool that we do have a measure, like real numbers, is really helping to open the discussion. Even if after we don't stick to the number, because this is not the point, but it really helps opening the discussion and see, okay, how are we today and where should we go? So how do we bridge the gap? And when we start talking about bridging the gap, we're not sticking to the numbers anymore. We already more in transferring this into attitudes and behaviors and really concrete actions on the ground.
Yeah. Miriam, how is this from your perspective in terms of?
So I would say that's one of the points I had in my notes. Having a common mental model is really, really, really important, because culture is a topic that everyone has an opinion, everyone has their perception, everyone has their baggage. So unless you have something that really connects all these ideas and perceptions and brings them to the surface, it's extremely difficult to move forward. So as I mentioned before, in the big industrial company, this model make the discussion so much easier. And it also, on the executive board level, it as every business unit had their own understanding, their own pace, their own priorities, etc., and challenges. It helped have a general discussion between all the executives in terms of where we are. Look, we all feel that way, but look, the model is showing that, our culture is a bit too focused on process instead of results. We all kind of knew it, but now we have an image where we measured it in so many different departments, and really it is a problem. Here's the problem. Also, we really want to be more, let's say, more people focused organization. We are very far on that dimension, or the other way around. We're very focused on people. We want to be a little bit less. So it helped also everyone kind of, we did some exercises with, I don't know what it's called, like a clicker where you give a score.
Yeah.
So you would ask people, where do you think we need to be? And then kind of come up with the score for everyone. And then we had the diagnostic score where we are. So also it helped align expectations of where we should be, or at least start, everyone has this expectation. It seems like it's very far from where we are. Let's take a baby step and do something here. We're maybe not going to go to this high level in 1 year, but maybe it's a vision that we want to keep having.
Kind of like a step-by-step approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was
Now,
very
there were some questions in the chat before we open up for Q&A, and I wanted to show something in terms of one of the, call it, competitive edges is the ability to map out different subgroups inside an organization, and very importantly, to map out the emotional desire. In your experience within your organizations, to which extent have you been able to use any potential gap between the optimal that was selected by a management team and the emotional preference that people have to drive a discussion on whether a strategic decision was perhaps not the right one? Have you had any experience with this to help them reflect critically on whether a rational decision is going to be emotionally sustainable?
Yeah, I had an example specifically on the D6, which is about the management philosophy, where people wanted to be more work oriented, and the emotional or the desire of people was far more people oriented, so almost to the extreme. Of course, it always has to be taken with a bit of cautiousness, because it's a bit detached from constraint, from economic reality. But still, it shows today that the people want to have a meaning in what they do. They want to be considered as an individual and not as a number. And they're not only for their performance and what they can produce, but also for the interaction they can have within the company. So it was interesting to see the gap between what the management wanted to install and what the people wanted to have. So it's brought a lot of reflection of, okay, what purpose is it serving for us to remain as much work oriented compared to what people would like to have. So that's a discussion in process for the moment.
And would you say that, like, if you compare the results with information you can get from an employee satisfaction or engagement survey, what would you describe as the biggest difference?
Well, the employee survey, I see it more as an individual and emotional picture. While here it has the advantage to show us a group picture. So the questions are the same for everyone, and they are quite framed so that we know exactly what type of results we get. So we have probably an emotional view with less emotional questions. I don't know if it's clear enough.
Miriam, how has this been from your perspective?
I was trying to reflect on this. I think for me, what I've seen more is what management thinks, a gap between what management thinks is the culture, or what management thinks is the bigger problem, or there is no problem.
No.
The survey kind of tells you what employees think or feel, perceive. And that can be very powerful, because a lot of times senior management doesn't really know. They think they know, but they don't really know. So I think it's actually, in my experience, doing this kind of diagnostics is something really useful for senior management, because they understand on one hand, okay, we had this strategy or this kind of culture we want to have, but people are perceiving other things.
Yeah.
So
So it's
that's
kind of
the
like a
focus.
reality check.
Yeah, reality check, and how things are how do you say, cascade down to the lower levels, because
Yeah.
a lot of times they don't have that contact with the low, depending on the hierarchy level in the organization. So that's one thing. And the other thing is it helps you kind of, I think someone mentioned in another context, figure out the blind spots. So you think everything is going well in this, but you're not sure how things are going well in this. So this really shows you some of these blind spots. And when you talked about different departments, so that's the other thing, like, are these departments having the culture we need for us to be successful as a company? Because you see in a lot of companies, you have silos, and you have all these internal wars and things that happen. So this thing takes it away from thinking what it is to seeing what it is.
Yeah.
A lot of the engagement surveys I've seen, they have so many questions. Again, like, because they're more detailed about what, let's say, HR or somebody else in the company wants to know at that particular moment, versus kind of getting a picture of the culture of your
Broader holistic picture. Yeah. And
holistic picture.
yeah, and thank you for raising that. Now, before we open up for public Q&A, there's already quite a good amount of questions in the chat. What you just raised as well is an important thing, that a lot of companies suffer from survey fatigue, and I think one of the beneficial, unique factors of our multi-focus model is that we can give organizations a whole range of inputs that are derived from cultural metrics, so that they can basically suffice with one survey as opposed to 30, 40 different types of surveys, simply because of the calculational logic behind the model that we use. There was a question in the chat regarding the influence of national culture. So I'll basically show another slide here. What we can do there is we can, for any organization, indicate that, for example, this organization, the overall company works in a Saudi way, even if it might not be a Saudi company. It just has cultural characteristics similar with that national culture. And you can see similar characteristics in certain of their subgroups. But then there are also different teams that have a different way of working. So that sometimes it's not the differences that actually are the biggest issue, is the perspectives of similarity. Now, Sophie, you mentioned that in a lot of the Planse workshops, Planse has offices all around the world. Have you seen differences in terms of how national cultures have connected to this topic? And did you have to persuade them in different ways, facilitate them in different ways to kind of make the message of how culture influenced their work come across?
Well, I would say even the way we make the presentation of or the way we lead our workshops will be a bit different from an area to the other. We work a lot in Europe, but we also work in the US. And also if I do have production people in the workshops or the management in the workshop, so that will obviously also make a difference. But yes, if I was in the US 2 weeks ago, and the approach is very different. The way to anticipate the results is very different, far broader. A broader perspective is enough. Then if you go back to some places in Europe, you have to go into a lot of details. You have to explain how the process works and what is all the machinery behind the tool. So yeah, you also find the national culture in those aspects. I don't
No,
know
I
if it's
love that.
the question that you asked me, but yeah.
No, it definitely does, because I think that's often sometimes people tend to forget that it's not just the results that matter, but also how we facilitate results that has an
Yes.
influence on how they are received in a way.
Mm.
And Miriam, if I think back to that large project that you were engaged in, although it was in Latin America, would you say that a region such as Latin America is very similar in its national culture, therefore that the results should be facilitated in a similar way? Or did you already there recognize that actually there are quite a few regional differences as well that you need to account for?
Interesting question, because uh, from outsider perspective, people lump Latin America as one entity, but Brazil, for example, has a different language than the rest of Latin America. People speak Portuguese, and they're a really huge country, so they don't really see themselves as the same as the Mexicans or the Peruvians, or they have a big war with the Argentinians about the football, and like, and for me the culture are quite different. Like Brazilian culture is a very indirect culture. Argentinian culture is quite direct culture. And when you talk to Brazilians about Mexicans, they think Mexicans are extremely indirect. So it's all different. And in that particular company, also there it was a national company within Brazil. So like the south of Brazil is very developed,
Yeah.
the north of Brazil is very undeveloped. So you had these kind of regional differences in many perspectives, like education levels, infrastructure levels. Like the south of Brazil is like Europe, let's say, in terms of infrastructure and education. Uh, the north of Brazil has like really low indices of any kind of basic like sewage systems, water systems, level of educational attainment, etc. So you had those kind of differences. And then this company specifically, it acquired a very large Canadian subsidiary. So they had a lot of clashes because Brazilian culture versus Canadian culture, but also because headquarters was Brazil. So the Brazilians expected the Canadians to act to adapt themselves to the Brazilian culture, whereas Canadians were like, no, we're a Canadian company. We don't need to listen to these Brazilians. So there's also a kind of cultural superiority
Yeah.
that was kind of reverted, but people were not accepting that those power changes. So there's so many different dimensions.
Thank you.
It's very difficult to answer it in a simple way about Latin
No, but I
America.
think I think this is a very good, I think also kind of insights that you both share with the audience, which is the reason why also as an organization we are called the culture factor is because culture has multiple components. And if we talk about cultural transformation, emotions play a role. one country to the next, a region to the next, a function to the next. All of that basically needs to be mapped. And I would say that is one of our competitive edges. It is the ability to connect both on the emotional and on the rational part of culture and bring it all together. Now, given that we have about 10 minutes left, I wanted to share before we get into the Q&A that if any of you present in today's webinar are deeply interested in this topic of culture, please do not hesitate to reach out to our sales team. We have virtual certification courses. We can do in-house certification courses. Physical certification courses are especially often organized by our Africa office. And we will have another physical course to all likelihood in Canada, near Toronto, towards the beginning of the autumn period. Anyways, please do follow our website for the latest dates and or reach out to our sales team. Now, I'm going to basically ask each one of you questions that have popped out in the chat that have not yet been answered directly or indirectly from our discussion. A very specific question: what would be the competitive advantage of our frameworks regarding culture with, for example, the competing value framework? If you've heard about that before, it's the Quinn and Cameron model, the Okai model. Okay, so for those of you that are not aware of that model uses two particular dimensions, and I think most of us agree that groups of people are more complex than individuals. When we use 5 dimensions to describe an individual, the big 5 personality test, when you map out an organizational culture, it is nonsensical to use less than 5 because groups of people are more complex than an individual. Hence, you need a greater level of granularity. So compared to other organizational culture models, either we offer a greater sense of granularity and or, in most cases, both. We add that emotional component to it. Especially Anglo-Saxon models have a very big fallacy, which is that they think the Anglo-Saxon way is the only way. And that means that in a multicultural organization, there is an unwritten bias in the way data is collected and processed, which means the results are relatively less useful. So that combination of organizational culture and national culture is a very important competitive distinguishing factor that should not be overlooked, which is also one reason why we spend quite a lot of time on this during our certification processes. So then let's go to another question. Let's see. If you want to implement or you want to guide that discussion of optimal culture in a multicultural environment, how much space have you given in your respective projects to letting national culture dictate the organizational culture? Meaning, if let's say you are an Austrian company or Luxembourgish company or Brazilian company, you say, this is the way.
For me, I think it's not like that. So, for example, I have one client now that they are based in kind of not even in a big city in Brazil. So 99% of the companies in Brazil. There's one guy in China. And they want to become a global company. And one of the discussions I've had with them was, well, you can't just abstract your Brazilian origin and say now tomorrow we're an international company, because most of your people in Brazil, you need to recognize that the Brazilian culture is going to influence whatever global culture you're going to build. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but you always need to take that into consideration and recognize those influences you're going to have, because you have all the Brazilians in there. So, and until you become a very diverse national company with having a lot of different people from different cultures, the Brazilian aspect is going to shape things. And then maybe later you can have a discussion about changing that. But just saying it doesn't matter is not realistic. That's kind of how I put it.
It's the recognition that it indeed will play a role. Yeah. Sophie, how has this been for you?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because in the example of Plan Z, It's an Austrian company, and the decision power is there. And it's sometimes very difficult to make them understand they are taking decision in a very Austrian way. And they need to be able to relate to how people will receive the message in being in Asia or India or in the America, so that people don't feel left out or do not feel that it's all imposed on them without exchange. So it's quite difficult, and it's true. It's most of the management is located there or is from there. So obviously that culture is quite strong, and
Yeah.
it takes time to dilute it a little bit and to have more decentralized decision places that takes over.
There's a follow-up question. So let's say that you have done a cultural measurement. You've aligned where a company differs between its actual way of working and what it has decided it wants to or needs to work like. How do you go about prioritizing change initiatives?
Yeah. That's also they're very interesting questions. Huh?
I just read up what the audience writes. This was the
Um,
unprepared, unscripted part.
Yes, we usually try to find out where it is the most painful, and where it is hampering the achievement of the objectives the most. And we management, they sometimes have their ID, and then when you go down to the lowest level, people are sometimes facing something very different. So we usually work on the results of the survey with people from the ground, and have their own analysis of the situation, and make their own priorities. If you had to change something, what is the most painful for you today? And then we have like this some priorities that come from them. And then these priorities are therefore then confirmed by the management. They say, yes, we're going to work on this, or they add something, or maybe decide on scaling up the priorities because of different resources or time. Time is always an issue on this.
It's the universal scarcity. Thank
Yes,
you,
yes.
Sophie, for sharing that. Miriam, in the Brazilian context, which is a bit more hierarchical, you could say, than the Austrian context, would that kind of bottom-up approach, whereby you connect with the workforce to let them prioritize their greatest pain points and then confirmed by management, would that work? Or have you seen different approaches? For example, leaders changing their own behavior.
Leaders changing their own behavior. I think that's a challenge, the biggest challenge for all cultures, because leadership wants something, but it's not about me. It's about those other guys that are doing the wrong thing. So I'm gonna skip this one, but I think even in Brazilian culture, although it can be more hierarchical, the hierarchy separates the leadership from the reality in sometimes. So I think leaders are not like, they're not gods, right? So they also have their insecurities about how what I'm doing affects the rest of the company. Or frustration is a lot of, so I heard a phrase that was really nice. Company is a system configured to achieve the results it has. So they see the results are coming in not at the ideal way that they want. Things take longer, or the margins are becoming smaller, or whatever it is that the business metrics they care about, but they don't know why this is happening or where exactly the bottlenecks are or whatever it is. So bringing them those insights from the lower level is actually very helpful. And one of the challenges that I've faced is also bringing the lower levels into the conversation and helping them. So a lot of times people won't share things in front of management.
Yeah.
But then you do this workshop where you bring people from different levels to talk to each other, and with the management. How do you get them to speak up? They would speak up in the survey, but the survey is very like, it's just a word or a
Snapshot.
number. What are the insights, or what could we do better? What are the suggestions? So a lot of times you have to do all kinds of group dynamics and mix people around to get the more junior people share their insights. And I think the more senior people appreciate it a lot, but sometimes they just don't know how to get those insights out in the open. So this is the challenge in these more hierarchical companies or cultures.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Sophie. Time flies. It is 1 hour since we started. A lot of good questions in the chat. My apologies that I basically posed those on your doorstep without sharing them up front because I didn't have the questions up front. Nonetheless, I do hope that for all of the audience that a lot of tangible insights were shared in terms of what makes this approach different from other approaches. How do you go about accounting for national cultural differences? How do you engage top leaders, workforce alike? Thank you for everybody in the audience for being with us here throughout this last hour. Do connect with each one of us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our newsletter at The Culture Factor, and we hope to see you in a one-on-one call in one of our next events. I wish you all a very nice continuation of your day. Sophie, Miriam, thank you so much for being present today, sharing, and to the team on the background for hosting today's session. Thank you, everybody. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.